Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guest for this series is Simon Dalby. Simon is a professor of geography and environmental studies at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, where he teaches in the Balsillie School of International Affairs. He's also a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Simon's latest book is called Anthropocene Geopolitics, Globalization, Security, Sustainability. The title was published by the University of Ottawa Press in early 2020, but it was overshadowed by the subsequent pandemic, so we're very happy to finally get a chance to speak with Simon about it. Fair warning, we're about to engage in a long discussion about the environment, sustainability, and what governments around the world are doing about it. As you can guess, it's a daunting subject with few bright spots. Nevertheless, Simon's book lays out a compelling case for situating our thinking around forward-looking strategies that can guide us toward peaceful outcomes. This series is brought to you with support from the University of Ottawa Press. In this first episode, we'll start with a discussion about Simon's research, how his book came together, and how being a geographer influences his writing. Okay, Simon, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Why don't we start? If you could just tell us a little bit about your background, your current research, and where you're currently teaching.
I'm a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario in Canada. And my teaching is all done these days in the Balsillie School of International Affairs, which is a joint school between Laurier University and the University of Waterloo. It's a graduate teaching program which involves master's and PhD students dealing with global governance and international affairs. I get to teach globalization, security, international environmental courses as well, which keeps me very busy.
Excellent. So your book, Anthropocene Geopolitics, has been out now for, about a year at this point? Or
a year and a bit.
Yep. Talk a little bit about the origin story, so to speak, of your book. How did you come to write it?
It's a long story. About a decade ago, some folks in Canadian border studies and political geography were putting together a major project just called Borders and Globalization, wondering about how it was that globalization was changing borders and what borders were doing to globalization. And because I'm a political geographer interested in many of those themes, they asked me to come on board, and they were looking for somebody to run the sustainability and environment theme in that project. And because that's one of the things I do, I came on board to focus on sustainability, environment, climate change, and related issues. Because obviously there are relationships between all of those things and borders. How borders work in terms of regulating trade is tied into things like the trade in endangered species and regulations about the pollution across borders also clearly relates. For all of those reasons, it seemed to make sense to have somebody thinking those things through in a theoretical way, with the plan being to have people work on various more empirical projects, looking at case studies and so on in all of those fields as part of the project. But I was the sort of a theory guru for this part of the project. Mm-hmm. That's what got me thinking about the Anthropocene and its relationship to geopolitics. It got me thinking about a whole lot more theoretical matters and about how the world was changing and how borders would therefore change their roles in this changing world. And really the book is the spin-off from our initial conversations about how to do this and why it was important and how we might make some theoretical innovations as we study borders and globalization around the notions of sustainability. So the book really came out of the conversations around those themes in the early stages of the project. It's easy to say all that stuff. It turned out to be a whole lot harder to think systematically about how to frame these issues. It turned out to be a whole lot more difficult to actually work through them and think about various different disciplines that apply because there's a whole lot of different disciplines involved in this. When you start juxtaposing geography, borders, administration, climate, and environmental change, you're dabbling in lots of fields. And so it turned out to be quite the intellectual exploration exercise for me.
Right.
And the end result was a series of papers and essays as I gradually sorted these things through, and then I pulled them together in one connected argument in the book. So it had a genesis over quite a few years with this project. This is sort of my final report, as it were, of the sustainability theme of the Borders in Globalization project.
Okay, excellent. Can you give us a sense of some of those disciplines that you did need to kind of cross over into to cover this in the book?
Well, obviously, there's some sort of public administration stuff because we're talking about borders. Obviously, there's some geography stuff because there's the very specific boundaries. There's the fences and walls and the social processes at the border, be it trade rules, be it passport checks, and all those kinds of things. But when you start digging into sustainability, then you start thinking about climate change in particular. When we're thinking about sustainability in terms of species, we're talking about biology, but we're also more explicitly talking about conservation. When you start thinking about conservation on the big scale, because this is a Borders in Globalization project, so we're trying to think about this at the very big scale, you inevitably get into thinking about biodiversity at the planetary scale. You start thinking about global ecological systems, and hence, of course, the burgeoning science of the Earth system science literature as well, which is probably the most important sort of single interdisciplinary influence on this book, because it was into that great big discussion about how the Earth as a system is changing that I got plunged, as it were, by the questions I was asking. Be careful what you ask as an academic, because it can lead you into all sorts of strange places that you mightn't initially think you will go. But in this case, it was absolutely fascinating intellectual adventure, trying to think through how Earth systems relate to political systems, and how sort of borders and boundaries are sort of key categories that link up in some way or another the social sciences and the physical sciences. And the Earth system, of course, is all about linking up the social and the physical, because, of course, what it's beginning to point to is the dramatic role that humans are now having in changing the physical Earth, changing its biological function, changing how, quite literally, the composition of the atmosphere is changing as a result of human activities. And those activities are spreading across borders. So when you put all that stuff together, you get an interdisciplinary mix that has been quite fascinating to work with.
Yeah, excellent. So I'm wondering then how sort of your background as a geography or geographer sort of influenced how you wrote and approached the topics.
Well, as a geographer, my undergraduate training was in a faculty of natural sciences. And so I had the advantage of having way back had some courses in geology in particular, paleontology, that's fossils, and stratigraphy, the sequencing of deposits of rocks and what that means in terms of Earth history. So once I started digging into this, in fact, having had that background way back helped, because geographers usually have a bit of this as well as some of the social sciences. So the advantage for being a geographer was I at least had some general sense of how these things worked, even if my formal training as a student in geology in particular was a long time back. But it gave me some sense of how to see how the world was changing in that long context. And of course, the Anthropocene is a word that implies a geological formulation. So having had a background way back there helped. I've also worked on international politics in numerous different ways, and specifically my work as a geographer in geopolitics was about how the imagination of how the world is organized plays in politics. Geopolitics is about looking at the rivalries of power amongst the big states in particular. But it's also about the knowledge practices that are brought to bear in those rivalries, how the world is described, and how one's place in that world is understood as a political actor. And of course, that's very useful as a way of grappling with borders, grappling with how they're changing, and grappling with what needs to be done about climate change and biodiversity loss. And don't forget important things like ocean acidification as well. Big physical processes that clearly spill across borders, but need to be grappled with by policies that are mostly made by states and administered by states. And the disconnect, of course, between global processes and state policies is one of the crucial things that this whole debate about globalization engages endlessly. Geography as a discipline is one of the best kept secrets in academia. It allows you to do all sorts of things that do cross disciplinary boundaries. We draw on social sciences, we draw on physical sciences, we draw on all sorts of technical stuff to do with geographical information systems as well. And putting it all together means that geography as a discipline, and some of us might argue it's not a discipline at all. It's actually a sort of an interesting intellectual location for synthesizing, pulling together things from different disciplines, asking questions that draw on sociology, that draw on political science, that draw on geology in one intellectual location. It might be understood to be an interdisciplinary discipline, and it has that huge advantage of allowing people to look into all sorts of interesting things in ways that are relatively unrestrained by the conventional division of labor in the academy. And that, I think, is probably the biggest advantage to being a geographer tackling a big topic like this, because it means I've been able to dabble in different fields and not have to apologize to a dean for doing so.
You just heard from Simon Dalby. Simon is a professor of geography and environmental studies at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, where he teaches in the Balsillie School of International Affairs. He's also a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation and the author of Anthropocene Geopolitics, Globalization, Security, Sustainability. This episode is brought to you in part by the University of Ottawa Press. Join us next week for a discussion about the geological era we're currently in, the Anthropocene. We'll look at what defines it and why it's having such a profound impact on the way we think about science and just about every other research discipline.
We needed something, so Paul Crutzen argued, that marked the fact that we now live in a period where human activity, or at least the activity of industrial, urbanized consumer humans, is beginning to dramatically change how the world actually works. It's changing how the world works in ways that, if you imagine yourself as a geologist 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 million years in the future, looking back at this period of the planet's history, you would realize that something really weird happened.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.